here is the story I heard from my father. About 30 years ago, my father used to make his own charcoal. He would burn oak and cedar in a charcoal kiln he built in the mountains. The process took about 4 days, during which he would live in a small hut next to the kiln. One day, he started the fire in the evening, but for some reason, despite not much time having passed since the last burn, the fire wouldn't spread properly inside the kiln. Rushing wouldn't help, so my father patiently added more firewood and kindling, and tended the fire by pumping the bellows. As night fell and silence reigned, the only sound to be heard was the crackling of the wood. Crack, crack, crack. Rustle, 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 rustle. There was a noise in the bushes behind him. An animal? He turned to look, but saw nothing. Crack, crack, crack. Rustle, 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 rustle. Suddenly, the noise started moving at an incredible speed through the bushes. At this point, my father had an intuition that this was not something of this world, and he decided not to turn around. Rustle, rustle, rustle. The noise began to circle the charcoal kiln. This was definitely not normal. My father stood still, keeping his eyes on the fire. Rustle. Hey, what are you doing? Just when he thought the noise had stopped, someone spoke to him over his shoulder. The tone was friendly, but he didn't recognize the voice. When my father remained silent, the voice continued on its own. Are you alone? Why are you by the fire? You're making charcoal, aren't you? The voice seemed to come from right behind him, so close it felt like he could feel its breath. My father battled the urge to turn around with all his might. The voice continued, is there a phone here? What? A phone? Confused by this strange question, my father was taken aback. This was a time before cell phones, and there was no way there could be a phone in the middle of the mountains. Relieved by the absurd question, my father let his guard down a little. There's no way something like that would be here. I see. Suddenly, the presence behind him vanished. After some time, he fearfully turned around to find, as expected, no one there. The dense forest was eerily silent. As he reflected on the events that had just transpired, he felt a wave of fear wash over him. Although he was terrified, he couldn't leave the fire. As he continued to tend the fire while reciting Buddhist prayers, the eastern sky finally began to lighten. By the time it was light enough to make out the surroundings, his father, my grandfather, came up the mountain carrying lunch boxes for 2. How's it going? Well, I've been burning it since yesterday evening, but the fire isn't getting into the kiln. My father didn't mention the strange occurrence from the night before. Let me take a look. My grandfather went around the back of the kiln and held his hand over the smoke from the chimney. It's getting warm. He then placed his hand on top of the kiln to check the temperature. It's still cold here. As he said this, he climbed onto the top of the kiln. Thud. With a dull sound, the top of the kiln collapsed, and my grandfather fell into the kiln. My father tried to rush to help him, but the poor footing and the smoke and ash obstructed him. Despite suffering burns, my father stepped onto the kiln to save his father. The inside of the kiln was red hot, like the fires of hell. The fire had already spread throughout the kiln. After a struggle, he managed to drag his father's body out, but by then his face and chest were horribly burned and he was no longer breathing. Unable to believe the tragedy that had unfolded before his eyes, my father was momentarily dazed. But he quickly gathered himself and decided to descend the mountain. However, it seemed impossible to carry his grandfather's body down the steep mountain trail. Alone, my father took about an hour to descend the mountain to the roadside where his grandfather's truck was parked. When he returned to the charcoal hut with an acquaintance from the village, something strange had happened to his grandfather's body. The burned upper half had completely turned to white bone. Only the white bones remained, as if they had been thoroughly gnawed on. In contrast, the lower half was untouched, with all the organs intact. Normally, animals like bears and wild dogs eat the internal organs of their prey. Moreover, there shouldn't have been any such large carnivores in this area. Everyone present at the scene noticed that the state of the body was abnormal. Regardless, No one mentioned it. They silently began to move the grandfather's body. When my father tried to say something, everyone quietly shook their heads. Then, my father realized this was a taboo subject. Who was the visitor who came to my father last night? What ravaged my grandfather's body? No one could answer these questions, no one could voice them. That's just how it is, an elder from the village told my father. To this day, the cause of my grandfather's death is officially said to be an attack by a wild dog.